Hey everyone, and welcome to a new video. Do you have problems shooting in challenging lighting conditions like too dark, too bright, backlit, dark shade, or full sun? If so, join the club. I recently went to Kenya for a photo safari and had to face brutal lighting conditions. In this part 1 video, I'll show you some images that I got on that trip in conditions that were really low light in pre-dawn and after sunset, the strategies I used to get them, and some processing tricks to make them look their best. Like this photo, shot at 1/15th of a second and at ISO 3200. In a second video, part 2 of this series, I'll show you how I handled conditions that were too bright, and my processing secret to turn this hazy, overexposed photo into this. Stay for my bonus tip, where I'll show you why this photo shot at ISO 12,800 with no processing doesn't appear to have that much noise, and how I managed to get it. My name is Simon D'Entremont, and I'm a professional nature and wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more.
Open up your mind sometimes. You'll be just fine.
So in February, I went to Kenya, and the experience was nothing short of amazing. Great people, great scenery, and great wildlife. But the photographic conditions there were very challenging, including very low light. The hot midday sun often makes wildlife inactive during the day, so really early and really late are the best times to find action, especially big cats like lions, cheetahs, and leopards. I'm used to living in Eastern Canada, where most of the year the sun comes up at an angle and takes a couple of hours to get harsh, whereas in Kenya, the sun rises straight up and gets super harsh in no time, making the window of perfect light very small. It seems it's always too dark or too bright. This part 1 video will focus on scenarios that are too dark. Let's start off in the pre-dawn. My first advice is to get on site for action before the sun rises. That's because the sweet spot of the golden hour just after sunrise is short, and you don't want to waste any of it driving to where the action is. As such, my guides and I would leave 30 minutes before sunrise to get on location. But what if we found something before sunrise? Do we sit around waiting for the sun to come up? Not at all. When I have a subject, I shoot. But how do we get photos of wildlife in the pre-dawn that are worth taking? My first technique is a purposeful spray and pray. Yes, that's right, I said it. Don't let anyone tell you it's a bad photography technique, and I'll tell you why. First off, it's not like landscapes or Milky Way photography where you can set up a tripod and shoot 5 or 10 seconds if needed. Or in a studio where we can just add some flash. Our subjects, like big cats, even if lazy, are still moving and we can't add light. The big challenge here is getting enough shutter speed without our ISO going too high and our images being so noisy as to be unusable. The first variable to get right in low-light photography is our aperture. In low light, we need all the light we can get onto our sensor, so use lenses with wide apertures like the 70-200 f2.8, or for longer lenses like my 600mm lens, I'm going to shoot it wide open at f4. Even if you don't own a fast lens, open the aperture as much as you can. Then the ISO needs to go high enough to get some shutter speed. When the aperture is fixed, the higher the ISO, the higher the shutter speed you're allowed to take. In this case, at 1/30th of a second, my ISO is still 5000, which for me is still usable from a noise perspective. But when I post a shot of the back of my camera on social media, I get comments like, "Isn't your ISO high?" I've made whole videos about this, but this reflects the advice that many are given that you should always shoot at the lowest ISO, like 100 or your base ISO. In this case, ISO 100 would give me a shutter speed of 2 seconds. Forget that. Also, forget the guideline that your shutter speed should be 1 over your focal length, so 1/640th of a second for this shot. We're dealing with really, really low light here. So what's the plan on this young male lion in the Masai Mara in the pre-dawn? 1/15th of a second, f4, ISO 4000. Shoot lots and lots of shots at ridiculously low shutter speeds and hope at least one is sharp. The trick is to use good technique though. On a vehicle, I like using a beanbag, which is great. Put downward pressure with your left hand at the end of the lens barrel and put some eyebrow pressure against the eye cup to stabilize the camera from mirror or shutter vibration. At these crazy low shutter speeds, using the electronic shutter can be helpful as it eliminates shutter vibration. So shoot, shoot, shoot. They're free. You only need a handful to be sharp. I shot a few hundred shots of this guy as the sky grew brighter. Most aren't sharp, as there was more movement than my pitiful 1/15th of a second shutter speed could handle. But the odd one is indeed sharp enough, even if not perfect, like this one at 1/15th of a second and ISO 3200. But with no light on them, they look flat. What can we do in processing to liven them up? First off, photos taken in sunlight usually have bright spots from the sunlit areas and shadows from the shady parts. As such, lowering the whites to get more details there and raising the shadows to find more information in the darker areas is usually a good idea. For pre-dawn, it's just the opposite. That's because the photo is lacking bright spots and shadows, as there's no direct light on it. It's just a little glow from the horizon where the sun will come up soon. As such, it's lacking contrast. So in processing, I'm going to add some whites and reduce the shadows. You can accomplish the same thing by adding contrast or making a slight S-curve in the tone curve. Here's a little contrast, but be delicate. These can really drive up the saturation to a point that it may look unnatural. Maybe a bit of vibrance and a little vignette. And finally, a bit of noise reduction if the noise is bothersome. Lightroom has some features built in, but I personally use Topaz products. And Topaz Denoise actually has a great sharpening slider that works great too. And for a final touch, brightening the eyes with a bit of exposure and noise reduction returns them to the glossy eyes that we expect to see. And voila, here's a final product. Now some purists will say, oh, and that image was shot at ISO 3200 and only has 8 stops of dynamic range. What does that matter? In this scenario, you have 3 options. 1, getting the shutter speed up to a normal 1/500th of a second, let's say, where the ISO would have been 100,000 by the way. 2, staying home to get more sleep or sit there doing nothing. Or 3, get a photo like this. Maybe not perfect, but if I flew halfway around the world to get line photos, this is much better than the other 2 options. Now I can push my ISO to 6400 or even 12,800 and get usable images, but I have a modern full-frame camera. If your camera is older or the sensor is smaller, it's best to have more reasonable expectations. ISO 3200 may be as much as you want to push it, but the same technique applies. Another encounter was this leopard that came out at sunset and was in the shade. It was getting quite dark. With my 600mm lens at f4, the ISO was 5000 or 6400 at 1/320th of a second, which I knew was borderline to get a sharp photo of a walking leopard. So I just kept shooting, hoping a few would be sharp. And the leopard even looked at me. Perfect. And with a bit of processing, highlights up, shadows down as before, add a bit of saturation, noise reduction and sharpening, voila. Pretty good for shooting in the dark when many people would have given up shooting. And if you feel like sharing, what's your favorite low light photography trick? Put it in the comments below. Me and other viewers would love to know. Okay, what else can you do in these really low light situations? Another technique is to use the brutally low shutter speeds to artistic effect. In Amboseli, we came across some flamingos before dawn. They were flying around a bit, which gave me an idea. There wasn't enough light to get sharp flight shots. So while waiting for more light, I shot flying flamingos at purposefully low shutter speeds. This is another one of those shoot, shoot, shoot situations. You only need a few to be decent. And unlike cars or helicopters where you can get the whole subject sharp by using slow shutter speeds while panning, for wildlife, the parts are moving relative to each other. So don't expect the whole bird or animal to be tack sharp, even with perfect technique. Getting the body or head sharp may be enough to make something artistic. So set your aperture as open as you can in this really low light situation, and set your shutter speed at something like 1/50th or 1/100th of a second, and the ISO at what is needed to get the right exposure. Then the trick is to try and mimic the movement of the subject in the frame so they don't move around in the viewfinder. Try to track as accurately as you can and fire tons of exposures. Most of them won't be sharp and will look like these. I find this is hard to do on a beanbag, so I was just doing it handheld. Just keep shooting. Your autofocus may struggle in this low light, that's normal. Pre-focus on something like a tree or a bush at the distance you expect the action, and it will speed up your autofocus accuracy. And with some luck and technique, you'll get a couple that look okay. Like I said, the subject doesn't need to be sharp all over. Just enough to show what the species is, for example. Let the blur be artistic rather than a mistake. Now, not all low light techniques involve slow shutter speeds. Sometimes in low light there's some action that you just want to freeze to get the best shot. That was the case with these bee eaters in Samburu, Kenya. About a dozen of these were flying around and it was the last few minutes of sunset. Most of the scene was in shadow, but when the birds would land, the backlighting through the wings looked great. So I asked my guide to position us so that the background was as dark as possible and the sun behind the birds. The great thing about these bee eaters is they return to the same perch after getting food. So every time the bee eater left the perch, I stayed focused on the branch. When the bird would return, my guide Newton would count down 3, 2, 1, and I'd fire off a few shots to catch the outstretched wings. For my settings, I made my aperture f4.5, just a bit stopped down for a little deeper depth of field to get the branch and the bird sharp, or 2 birds if I was lucky enough. Then I started with my shutter speed at 1/2500th of a second, which was about as low as I could get to get really sharp shots consistently of these flighty birds. With a few tries, I indeed got the shot I wanted, like this one right here. After I got it, I told my guide, now what I need is 2 of them to land on the branch at the same time. Voila, 5 minutes later. And then a couple of minutes later, the sun set and the opportunity was finished. It only lasted 15 minutes, but I got plenty of great shots. In processing, I lowered the overall exposure and shadows, which were mostly background. Then I raised the highlights so that the light through the wings would pop. A bit of saturation and noise reduction. Voila, here's the final image. I didn't worry about the dark exposure on the bird's body. The wings are the subjects here. Now for my bonus tip, how did I get the shot at ISO 12,800 and even before processing the photo doesn't look that noisy? I didn't underexpose and expose the photo as dark as the scene looked. It was actually darker than it appears in the photo, but I exposed it a bit brighter, a technique called ETTR, or exposed to the right, where you place the histogram as far right as you can without clipping the whites for your photo exposure. By doing so, you get more light onto your sensor, leading to less noise. That's because high ISO photos actually benefit from exposing brighter with longer shutter speeds and larger apertures and processing darker rather than exposing dark and trying to brighten later, a mistake many make, which makes the noise look worse. Some people might try to shoot this shot at a lower ISO like 8000 and underexpose and think that the lower ISO will deliver better results. It won't, as you can see in this elephant shot. It's a busy mess at ISO 8000, far noisier than the previous photo at ISO 12800. Expose the image at a minimum appropriately and even a bit brighter than the scene. Here's another ISO 8000 elephant, appropriately exposed and look way cleaner than the underexposed one. High ISO is not the creator of noisy images. It's low light, or low signal to noise ratio more specifically. The high ISO is revealing that your photo has noise in it, not making the noise. If that was confusing, I've made 2 whole videos to explain the relationship between ISO and noise. You can see one of them right here. And don't forget to come back for part 2 of my Kenya trip, where I show you how I dealt with bright sunshine and how I turned this photo into this. If you thought this video deserving, give it a like and YouTube will show it to other photographers who would benefit from learning these low-light photography tricks. And I hope you can use these tips to go out and get your own amazing low-light photos even after other photographers would have packed up and gone home. I know you can do it.